very warm welcome to all of us once again. The topic of our conversation today is the business of news, turmoil, tribulations, and trumps in the media industry. Our esteemed guest for the evening today is Parry Ravindranathan. Parry is a global executive and angel investor, and he was until very recently president and managing director international for Bloomberg Media. Prior to that, he was the managing director of Asia for Bloomberg as well, where he oversaw rapid expansion of its business, making it amongst the dominant news media companies in the region. Parry has extensive experience in international markets, having lived on and worked in 3 continents and traveled to over 100 countries in his career as a journalist and a senior media executive. Parry serves on the board of digital media companies, and he writes a monthly column on the trends in consumer tech and media for Bloomberg Quint. Welcome, Parry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
We are so delighted to have you here, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Friends, in conversation with Parry today, we will be having our very own Professor Ravi Miglani. Although I know that all of us would have seen in the announcement that we were supposed to have Ashwin Kumar in the conversation, but due to unavoidable and urgent change of plans, he had to be somewhere else. However, I think Professor Miglani needs no introduction. He is the Professor of Practice of Management with Ahmedabad University. And I'm sure we all are aware that he heads this conversation series. And he is also the director of the Global Executive MBA in Pharmaceutical Management with the Ahmedabad University. Last week, in fact, he was also in conversation on a very interesting topic on food, which is his passion. So I think not taking any more time, I will hand it over to Professor Miglani to please begin the conversation with Parry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bijal, and thanks, Parry, for being here. And apologies to everyone. I'll try to live up to what Ashwin would have done, but you'll have to live with me. Ashwin had to be pulled away for something urgent. So sorry about that, but I'll try to do my best. But anyway, you are here to listen to Parry, not to me. So no change of plan there. So Parry, just to start us off, I mean, no one in the audience needs to be told that media is in turmoil and has been in turmoil for many years, if not longer, at least in the last decade, since the advent of social media and the advent of partisan media, and how media has become political and media has become, at least traditional media, as well as social media, has become caught in politics, caught in corporate rivalries, and it's and so on. So without listing the sorry state of all that has happened with media, can you, with your long-term view, you have been associated with media in a big way for many years. Can you trace where it started and why are we where we are today? What brought us here?
So I was just saying that I think everyone has a tendency to blame media for pretty much all the ills in society, I think. But I think the reality is media only really sort of is reflective of the society we live in. I think we are living in probably the most sort of partisan, sort of polarized society we have ever had. And I think everyone traces their origins in different ways. In the US, they trace it to Trump's rise, but really Trump was a symptom of it, a sort of end result of it. But really, all of that is really, most of it has been happening for years. And in some ways, the media has been reflecting that. I just don't think that media created that partisanship. Of course, it played its role. It's not, it's not done itself any favors in many parts of the world, and kind of has sort of fueled the fire. Let me put it. But I'm less. I don't think I am less. I'm more hopeful about media than others tend to be, and maybe it's because I'm a journalist. I'm biased. I ran a media organization. I know how tough it is to kind of balance everything, especially in this world where it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. On pretty much anything to do with politics, if you if you put out a report, there'll always be people who actually have, sort of views that are opposing that. But let me just take it a little bit back. I mean, I don't know whether you've seen this excellent movie on Netflix called News of the World. It's a very slow movie by Tom Hanks, where Tom Hanks goes from town to town reading newspapers. It's fascinating. We have come from that to a time when where information is scarce to a time where information we've got too much information. It's an overload. So I think the role of media itself has changed, and certainly news media has changed in that time. Media was essentially disseminating information that they saw, documenting what they saw to people who did not have that information. Today, it's actually the other way around. People have all the information in the world. Media's job is to actually try and compress it and give it to you. So, you have so the word curate, I don't think I've ever heard the word curate more than the last 5 years. And actually, it kind of captures media, news media, more than any other word, because we are essentially now in a world of curation, because we have so much information that we are essentially now trying to curate it. Of course, a lot of great media companies are creating, are reporting and actually creating, creating reports that actually is, factual reports, etc. I also do think that we are in some ways, at least in India, when we talk about India itself, we're talking about, there are lots of new media organizations on the rise. I think we always talk about the traditional media setup when we're talking about the decline of media, etc. And I think the traditional media is itself changing. In places like the US, the traditional media has actually has kind of, depending on which organization it is, the New York Times, the Washington Post has kind of come out and kind of re-emerged as a real force once again. And in India, I think what we are seeing is a fairly big entrepreneurial sort of, news entrepreneurs coming in. I mean, it's just some incredible piece of journalism coming out of those small organizations. I mean, the one thing I would say for the news media ecosystem is that it needs investment. I think there are 2 or 3 factors of the future that everyone who consumes news should think about. If you're an investor in news, be patient. I always say the venture capitalists should invest in news and be patient with it. Most people are happy to see a Flipkart lose billions and billions of dollars, but not very happy to see a media organization lose a little bit of money. Then there's governments. Governments have to stay out of the way. I mean, governments should stop trying to kill them. You should try and create an environment where news media can thrive. And third, I think is upon us, incumbent on us to actually make sure none of this comes free. There is a cost attached to it. People grumble over small little subscription fees. This is not going to come free. We got to be able to have it in our heart to be able to pay for content. And it's easy to blame news media when you're not paying $1, you're not paying a rupee, and say they're not doing a great job. But that ecosystem has to thrive, and for it to thrive, we all need to play a part.
So in this response, I know when you using the word media, you are probably looking more at
news media.
What we now call traditional media, the television and print. Yeah. And then there is this whole elephant in the room, the social media. So the comments that you have made apply mainly to traditional media, you mean, or to all media?
So all media. I mean, it's social media is essentially social media platforms are essentially aggregators. They aggregate and put things together. The real actual news production is mostly coming from you'd say traditional media. When I say traditional media, I usually refer to old media organizations, which are sort of legacy media, which is print. I don't think anyone can afford to be just a print player or just a TV player. It's across everyone's a digital player, etc. But I do include them as well as the new media players. When I say new media players, I'm talking the digital entrepreneurship that's going on in media. Some incredible ones, News Minute in Bangalore, which I read pretty much all the time. There's Morning Context. There's Bloomberg Quint, which which is very close to my heart. also on the business side. I mean, there are a lot of these new digital-only players which are thriving. I think they're doing some great journalism, and increasingly you're seeing more bolder journalism in that part of the universe than even the pure traditional linear platforms. Let me say, linear media platforms.
Yeah, yeah. The thing that seems to have happened, and you are in the forefront of that, is that um, earlier we used to depend on media to tell us what happened. Now we don't really need to wait for a TV news at 9 o'clock or a newspaper tomorrow morning to tell me what happened. Most people know what happened quite instantly. If nothing else, on their WhatsApp groups, everyone
Yeah,
suddenly knows that there has been a protest here, or a plane crash there, or floods here, or whatever. So journalism's role obviously has moved up the food chain several rungs, from just from telling what happened to telling why it happened, and
yeah,
the story behind the story, and the interpretation, and the views. So moving from news to views, and journalism's role is much more in views, while news has become a commodity. Everyone gets
yeah,
news free instantly. So
yeah.
how does that change what new generation of journalists are having to learn and do?
I think it's interesting that the poll that you did. I know it's a microcosm. It's a microcosm of microcosm. But the thing is that the social media is social media is one of the ways you get news. But if you actually do a media organization that have done research for years, find that now almost 80-85% of news, certainly news consumption, is coming through social media. People are using Twitter and every other, all sorts of apps as aggregator apps, where you're getting into the morning and the first thing you're looking is for you're charting through your preferred publications and everything else. So that itself is a fairly significant change in the way you are consuming news. What you waited when we were kids, you would wait for World This Week, at a certain time, or a daily news. That's by a few seconds today. So that's one. I think the news consumption, its cycle itself has changed. Second is, I think the you mentioned news is commoditized. I think that's an absolutely good point, because news commoditization is probably one of the biggest trends of the last few years. But it still needs to be produced by someone. It doesn't automatically appear onto these platforms. Someone is digging, someone is finding out, someone is going and finding trump's uh, trump's tax returns, someone is doing the hard job of getting that. Once it's on the table, then that's where the views take on. The problem with views and opinion, it's a double-edged sword, where opinion and news, basically views become basically the dominant dominant sort of, essentially the dominant consumption. And that's never that's that obviously comes with both. It's highly subjective, depending on what platform you're watching. And that's why you're seeing this hugely polarized sort of world, where people are watching, depending on where you are. And in India, it's, if you're watching Republic, that's what you're watching, that's your evening consumption. If you're watching in the US, if you're watching Fox, that's your worldview is essentially built around that consumption. So, and then of course you consume, and in social media too, in social media and everything else too, you have these are already polarized. You kind of consume what your opinion matches with, or your view matches with, or the other way around, where you're being shaped by that opinion. So that's the problem, where we are living in a world where it's kind of all blurred. These lines are all blurred. And opinion has become the more sort of, a lot of people actually even mistake opinion for news. I know so many people who have asked me and said, they read a piece on it, and I pointed out to them and said, that's an op-ed. And they said, no, so that's news. I said, no, it's not, it's an opinion. So people don't realize, don't know the denominations, or even the differences between what opinion and news is. And that's I think that's where polarization is getting. That's where things are getting more and more polarized, because you are essentially now trying to hear only the views that you agree with, or you kind of sort of have a sort of affinity with. And that, I think, is going to is changing the news industry as well in a big way. you don't have that many non-partisan, 100% non-partisan media organizations left in it. And that's the unfortunate truth. There are people who do some great reporting, but when it comes to the opinion part, it actually becomes very fuzzy. It becomes very, it's a very gray line.
So in that spectrum, and while I fully agree that what's happened to media as in becoming partisan and becoming so polarized is not caused by media. Media is a symptom of that. It's caused by society and politics, and media is a symptom of that. But on that, while everything is polarized and we have the New York Times and the Washington Post and Al Jazeera's and the BBC's and then we have the Republic TV and Fox News.
Yeah.
In that spectrum, do you see any kind of shining lights of news organizations that are kind of standing firm in the middle and not getting carried away by these partisan views?
I think there are quite a few. I mean, even in India, I mean, like, there are plenty of ones who are doing some great journalism work, opinion aside, great journalism work. In the US, I think, New York Times is still still a paper of record. I know in business news which I was looking after for a long time, Bloomberg for financial and business news. One of the polls said that people watch it for a broad spectrum of news, but actually consumption is essentially changing to niches as well. So if you're going for technology, you're going to use somewhere else. You're going for politics, you're going somewhere else. And the more developed markets, it's actually becoming it has become very, very niche now. People go for Politico or one of those kind of niche ones for politics, so information, etc. for tech. And I think that's coming everywhere. But I do think that there are a lot of organizations in there which are in the middle. The problem is that, the moment you say in the US, you have, a New York Times, which actually writes pieces about Trump and etc. And then they get criticized for being left of center. That said, before Trump came into being, the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, these guys have been writing stories about them as well. Everyone forgets that, So I think there are still several news organizations that's completely in the middle. Of course, they may be slightly left of center or right of center, but essentially doing the role of what they should be doing, covering news as it happens. And of course, there's an opinion pages and all sorts of things. They're trying to get different opinions. I know New York Times got into a big problem getting a very right-wing opinion. The problem was the facts on that were wrong. It was a senator that they got on. But the thing is, it's essentially they all trying to kind of find some middle ground and trying to get more views in the middle. So there are plenty of organizations. I think there are too many shining lights out there. I think the challenge is that there's an underlying economics of the entire news industry, and that's under huge attack. That's under huge challenge over the last many years now, whether it's by Facebook, Google, the duopoly, or by or their own faults. To be honest, so example I always give is I can never understand, and maybe it was after the internet. I'm kind of first of the internet generation because by then .coms began. Is that I never understood why newspapers used to charge for the actual print edition, but give everything for free on the internet from the start. I don't know what the logic was to begin with. Now they got too much traffic. Bringing it all back is a challenge. But if they actually did it from the start, people would have got used to the idea of paying for what they already pay for, the offline product, and being able to give it to the online one. So I think there, and that challenge of economics has actually created some of the problems that you see in the overall media industry.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring in the challenge of the business model or the monetization of news. And that is where, because large number of large media houses are either controlled by business interests, corporates, because someone has to pay for it, and the cover price of a newspaper or free TV channel doesn't pay for it. So they are either uh, beholden to their corporate owners, or a lot of small print media, at least in India, especially the regional languages print media, are beholden to the government, because government advertising is probably what supports a lot of them.
Yeah, even big
Um,
media.
uh,
Yeah.
and so either they are beholden to their owners, or to the advertisers, or to their political godfathers. So in that situation, how does a media house kind of steer through these pressures and still manage to bring out credible material? Mm.
I think it's easier said than done, but I think you have to keep innovating. Media has been media for for all sorts of reasons has always been reactive to technology. They have always reacted to something that happened, and sometimes react quite sort of, after quite a long time. So, so there's a long gap between actual, when a technology is adopted and they actually get into it. You've seen in pretty much everything, including social media, where many of them kind of gave things for free, and then they suddenly realized, oh my God, we're giving things for free, and then try to pull things back, and kind of it was mostly a reaction to something. One, I think they have to, everyone has to adapt to technology that's changing every day. You cannot hold on to the old platforms that you kind of knew and made money for you for decades, and hope that the next decade is going to look like that. Newspaper owners shouldn't hope that the next decade is going to look anything like the last 2 decades. And it's the same way for television channels. Things are moving so quickly. I remember sitting through a presentation a few years ago where someone was talking about the growth of TV in the next 20 years, and it was a hockey stick growth and all sorts of things. I remember this was about 5-6 years back, and the question I had was, do you really think there's going to be a TV as a device, or broadcast or cable as a way of actually watching television? And frankly, we've already seen it. Few years down, and we are, cord cutting is the biggest trend everywhere. So I just think that most people don't adopt technology as quickly as they do. That's one. Two is, I think, like I said in one of the earlier things, you need more and more investment into the media space. I think in the US, you're seeing there's a huge growth in certain media companies, in niche media companies, and largely because there are investors who are willing to put money into it and wait. We don't see that enough in place like India. It's angel investment. Everyone's kind of is bottom of the barrel sort of investment that you get is just not enough. And third, like I said, I think government regulation, and in a place like India, I think government regulation is a problem. Few months ago, about 6-7 months ago, digital media also came under the foreign direct investment ambit. Only 26% is allowed. Who's going to put the rest of the 74? No one thinks about that. It's going to be some corporate. It'll be someone with government interests. And the moment you have access to or control over the business model, you have control over the platform. So I think unless that changes and media becomes a business you can thrive in, where entrepreneurs can, without hesitation or thinking of actually spending all their time dealing with regulators or with corporates or the government for advertising, unless that changes, I think it's a tough business to be in, and I think it'll be difficult to thrive in that business. And that's unfortunate, but that is the reality of it. I think it's incumbent on all of us to basically for the media industry to thrive. It is the fourth estate. Continues to be a fourth estate in my view. It's a very important pillar, and it has to thrive. And I think everyone would want it to thrive. That's the important thing.
So what is I know there are no easy answers, but even when there is a big source from where people are aggregating and getting news, like social media, say Facebook, for example, or Twitter, but even though a wide range of views are available on these social media platforms, I and anyone naturally, either intentionally or unintentionally, gravitates towards an echo chamber, and you follow people who say things you like, and they follow people you, and you follow them,
Yeah.
and we all get into this bubble. And like we saw with disastrous effects in the Trump era and in the last elections in the US, and similar things keep happening in India. Either you are in this camp or that camp, and you don't even know what the other camp is saying because you've insulated yourself in that bubble, and you are following only people who talk your language. So what is the way
So,
out of that?
so I think, so it's not just us, right? If you consume, say, 2, 3 articles, the algorithm, essentially, it's algorithmic on a social media. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, any one of them, they are going to, if you consume a certain kind, that's all you're going to get. That's essentially what will surface, okay? Unless you go looking for something else. That's what's going to surface. So that's a challenge, because that's essentially, the algorithm has basically taken control of your choice without you knowing it, essentially. And that's unfortunately how echo chambers are built, you know. And it's kind of that kind of, that boat has left the harbor in some ways, because it has become so algorithmic. Almost our life has become so algorithmic that essentially you are only in every way getting only what you have already searched for or you want. And that's in, e-commerce, as the movies you watch, you watch Netflix or any one of them, they will surface things that are closer to what you watch or they think you like. The algorithm, not someone sitting outside, sitting and kind of making that choice for you. And that's really, our life has kind of taken an algorithmic sort of role. So that's one thing that is very difficult to fight. The second thing is, I think it's really difficult. You have to be curious about what other news or other views are out there. Most people are not curious, and that's not their fault. They don't have time, because you have, you have only finite time in a day, and you're kind of trying to figure out what I should see, and things are surfacing, and you're either seeing or reading it, which makes it very difficult for you to actually make a fairly informed choice, or a choice to actually go and find something new or a new view or anything of the sort. And on top of that, now it's all, there are other things. There are other information that comes in. There's, WhatsApp chats. There are, it's amazing the amount of consumption we have from WhatsApp chats, the number of articles that come through to you, etc. That through WhatsApp groups that kind of have, again, it's, sort of fairly similar views. People kind of follow similar views. And now the big new shift for media is there's a huge thing of the creator economy, where people are creating and putting on to YouTube and pretty much any platform, Substack, for newsletters, which is essentially a new layer of information and content, which did not exist before. Which means that all of us, they're bypassing the traditional roots of journalism itself. Someone who has a newsletter on Substack doesn't need and garners an audience and gets paid for it. Essentially, doesn't need an aggregator like a New York Times or any one of those guys. So that's a new layer, and that makes it even more complicated, because then that again narrows things a little bit further, niches, but also narrows view. You kind of subscribe to newsletters that you kind of journalists who have a view. It's actually quite interesting. The other part of the poll, why people sort of who do they trust, the news organization or journalists? The journalists came higher, and that's actually it's actually keeping with the trends. That is what an influencer is. Essentially, people are now sort of navigating towards influencers who have a fair amount of control on the content you consume. So I think I don't think there is an easy fix or easy sort of way to put it. Like I said, I think there is still a fairly large audience which consumes news for the brands that they've grown up on or because they think it's credible. There is to be fair, there is a big tussle on regulation on Facebook and all the Facebook, Google. You saw it in Australia where they're trying to regulate it and make sure that they're paying a fair value to what they think is fair value to publishers, etc. I don't think that's the long-term solution, but there is an attempt to actually be able to regulate these kind of platforms. But these platforms this is technology. Today it's platforms like Facebook and Google. Tomorrow will be platforms that you cannot control, because there are people who are consuming on it and people who are putting their own content on it and that's employment, so you can't take that away. So regulation and most of these things kind of don't catch up for years, and by that time it's just too late to save what you call traditional media or what traditional media, credible media brands, because by that time it's just too late.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, that sounds exciting and scary at the same time. uh, so and thanks for bringing in these other platforms like Substack, for example. So if journalists and content creators can create a brand around themselves and post their content and newsletters on Substack and get paid directly per piece, like for every piece from every kind of subscriber, and we have influencers on Instagram and other social media who are monetizing it through other
Already,
things like sponsorships and advertising and so on. So does that mean in a few years from now we would not see these big media brands that we have all grown up on? Would they become irrelevant, you think? Mm.
I don't think they'll become irrelevant, but I do believe that the next big media company will come out of this new creator sort of economy. There's a reason I say that, because a Substack is great for if you're an individual journalist at a time when traditional media is kind of laying off people. Here's an opportunity for journalists to actually be able to be independent, get a direct audience, and have a direct relationship with a subscriber, which would not happen before. You kind of dependent on a newspaper or an organization for that, and you're at their whims and fancies. And I think when we talk about creator economy, it started years ago. Essentially YouTube and all of them are part of the creator economy. They were the first layer of it. But now there's a huge focus on helping people who with creativity to actually create their own content and create it out there. What does it mean for journalism? I think the difference is, so what's happening in places like Substack and everything, and this is what I think is going to happen in the future is a lot of journalists together, band up and kind of out of become, sort of almost like a cooperative, actually, with niche, each one of them are niches, and kind of being able to provide these slightly larger sort of, larger amount of news to a subscriber, or bandied up, which basically will which is a media company of its own. So instead of getting one newsletter from a journalist, so I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, and when you at the end of the month you end up thinking, oh my god, it's actually quite expensive to go at it all. Each one to have many newsletters on top of all your subscriptions that you're paying for organizations. But I do think that they'll all come together and there'll be new ways to collaborate, and these guys will all collaborate a lot more and eventually form a media company that actually is going to look very different from the traditional media companies that we are used to anyway. I mean, I think it'll take a different form. I don't think it'll die, and I think we are seeing large organizations adapt. New York Times has adapted. Everyone said they would die. Almost not even very long ago, but 8 or 9 years ago, everyone thought it's dead. New York Times is finished. To now, when it is, when they have 7.5 million subscriptions and rising every year, I have no idea whether it will continue to rise after Trump. But the thing is, it's a fairly big force, and it's actually profitable, and it's growing, and they're experimenting. They're doing movies, they're doing different kinds of things, and I think the ones that innovate and try new things are not, are able to adapt to different sort of both technology and different trends. I think will survive. I'll give you an example. Just 2-3 days ago, it's a revenue story really. Time Inc. Went and sold an NFT, a non-fungible asset, basically a fungible token they created digital prints of their 1966 famous cover called God is Dead, and actually had versions of it, and they auctioned that NFT and made money. It was an experiment. It's run by a very a former colleague of mine, Keith Grossman, was brilliant, and they experimented with something. New York Times experimented with NFTs. So my point, I'm not saying that's the future, but I do think that experimenting with new technology and experimenting with new platforms is the way forward. And some of them will adopt, some of them won't. I think some of them will merge, some of them will become bigger by merging, some of them will just not survive.
Yeah, one other, which we have probably not directly talked about, but one other way in which a lot of these so-called legacy media organizations are innovating and kind of adapting and staying in touch with the times is podcasting. And that's a personal kind of obsession of mine. I spend half my life listening to podcasts because it's a very multitasking kind of media. I can listen to podcasts while doing almost anything else. So I spend hours every day listening to podcasts, and I am amazed on how organizations like the New York Times, who have dozens of amazing podcasts, or BBC Sounds is now like they have podcasts on practically any topic you are interested in. And they are monetizing it through sponsorships and advertising. Podcasts are still free to listeners, but they have other ways of having revenue coming in. So is that and there's a lot of talk not just about podcasts, but that voice is the future, and we've recently seen a lot of voice-based things coming up, like Clubhouse, for example, recently. So is voice a future of the media, or one of the futures of the media?
Huge. It's both. It's weirdly both are past and future. Radio was voice, and it's kind of made a comeback. It's not now called radio, but it's essentially voice in a different form. And podcasts, podcast was one of the largest growing part of my last media organization, for Bloomberg as well. It's a huge growing part of our portfolio. And it's pretty much for anyone. And I think the good part is the economics are kind of working out. There is a hunger for podcasts. There's a hunger for content in the audio world. And because of that, I think quality podcasts are getting acquired and there's a huge competition among platforms. Spotify is in it. There's Apple in it. There's Amazon just made an acquisition in podcast. Everyone's in it, and it's the next big. It's pretty much like what Netflix and Disney Plus, and there's plethora of content to watch, and there's actually more to watch than there is than we can ever consume. It's similarly, I think podcast is going through that. The good part is podcast is it's kind of fueling a great form of journalism as well, because the long form has taken a really good, you can see some great long form journalism, both in India and abroad, where you find some really great material coming out of it, and I think it's a huge, and it's easier to monetize. It's again, like I said, economics are working out. Again, the creator model, the audio is actually the one that has actually it's actually gone ahead of everyone else, because Spotify started paying very early for people who have an audience, etc. And then there's Clubhouse, because Clubhouse is, I'm amazed by people who want to have endless conversations on Clubhouse. You can go on Clubhouse and find, there are people who actually go on, multiple sort of rooms and actually just keep going between rooms and kind of keep hearing as they work and all sorts of things. So I don't know how much work gets done when you're listening to Clubhouse, but clearly it's a trend, and I think it's not just them, right? We're seeing Twitter Spaces, which they've gotten to audio, and I'm sure the others, the Facebooks, etc., will get into the same thing. And I think it'll just keep growing. So yes, I think podcast is a huge growing area, and it's also slightly at the moment slightly easier monetizable sort of product in some ways.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. Podcasts is amazing, and long form journalism. I don't know whether you're familiar with Amit Verma and his Seen and the
Oh
Unseen.
yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. Yeah, I hear it all the time. Yeah.
Every week he kind of stretches my uh, my belief that how long can I listen to a podcast. His podcast used to be 2 hours,
Exactly.
now they're 3 hours. He's crossed the 4 hour mark lately,
Yeah.
and he engages you for 4 hours, and that I
Exactly
don't
on
think
and
that we
subjects.
interview in print or even on video. I don't think I
On
would sit
TV.
for 4 hours watching an interview.
No, because you can do the other things when you're hearing it. I think
Mm.
that's the, it's basically, it has a huge utility value, which other media organizations, especially attention, other you need full attention. Whereas this one, you can just put it on and hear. And Amit's thing is one of the, best ones out there. And it kind of engages you through the, 2 or 3 hours. It's one of the few podcasts where, you want to listen more. It's fine. I mean, if it extends more, I'm going to listen to it. And different subjects. And the other thing is podcasts allow you to do fairly complex subjects, whether it's history or there's just so much that you can do on podcasts apart from just pure vertical news. Of course, there are some great news examples as well, like the Daily from New York Times, Vox Explained. I think most of them are very good news podcasts, but there are lots which are outside of news, but current affairs, but long form journalism as well. And that's I think it's a golden age for audio, really. It's a
Yeah.
golden age for all content. I would say it's golden age for all content outside of pure commoditized news. It's a golden age. The kind of variety you have today, it's impossible. I just don't know how many things I can subscribe to, but if I could, I would subscribe to as many as I can. Because of attention, you don't really, you cannot, you can only that, I have two small kids. I have to make sure that I'm spending some time with them.
Yes, yeah, certainly. And that's where podcasts come in handy because you can
Exactly.
take care of kids and go for a jog or cook,
Exactly.
do your cooking and household chores and sit through boring meetings
Beautiful.
while still listening to podcasts.
Exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, and all other audio, whether it's Clubhouse or now recently Twitter has gone into that space with Spaces,
Spaces.
and everyone is getting into audio. So that seems to be so. Just before we have just a few minutes left before we go into Q&A, and many amazing
Sure.
questions are popping up as you would be seeing. So,
Sure.
so before we get there, so we've talked about audio, we've talked about video media or television. So print as in newspapers, I know that many newspapers like the New York Times or many great Indian newspapers like the Times of India have evolved beyond being newspapers and created a large following online. But so is the paper version of the newspaper is in its dying days, you think, the actual paper?
I I think it depends on geographically where you are. To be honest, in the West, it's kind of declined faster because of the cost of newspapers. The cost of newspapers are higher, and so it's declined quickly. In India, a place like India, it's at or Japan. Japan is another big print market. Some of the largest media companies out of Japan are all fairly big print markets, and they're largely because in a place like India is largely because the costs were kept down for so long. But that has changed because it's a volume game. So if the volume starts coming down, the economics don't work for that. So I do think that eventually, I don't think print is going to completely die. I handled a print product, Business Week, which obviously Bloomberg owned. One of the biggest things we did to Business Week was not really confine ourselves to think of it as a magazine. It is more than a magazine. It's a brand that lives across digital, across events. There's a plethora of things that you can kind of stretch that brand across. And instead of thinking of it only as a magazine, and there are plenty of examples of media companies that have actually transformed into that. I mean, I gave you the example of Time Magazine, which got bought out by Mark Benioff of Salesforce. They kind of have undergone the same change where they've kind of turned itself into a more digital sort of business. I don't think any of these will die, and they're big brands, they're big credible brands. The Hindu is a good example. They've gone the subscription route on their online business as well, which is a very big step. I think it's a good step. I think everyone should go there eventually, because I think it's really important for the economics of the media business. And I think they will live on once the actual transition fully happens. The day you have more subscribers on digital than you have on TV, the economics of the media businesses of that media business has changed.
Yep, exactly. So that was great. So just to close off some of the other media kind of types before we move on to questions is, so far we've been talking about media as in news media or business news media, but media is much wider than that. What would be your opinion on, for example, cinema as a media? Because of streaming and Netflix and so on, and especially in the last year with people stuck at home, and Netflix went through the roof, and not just Netflix, but Disney, Hotstar, Amazon Prime, and everyone went through the roof. So are cinemas as a medium dead? Do you think we'll ever go back to cinema?
No, I actually don't think at all it's dead. I think it will change. It's, some of this is, accelerated some of the trends that was already on, right? OTT has brought a lot of cinema home. Um, but I don't think cinema theaters are dead. I think there will be a differentiation in what is shown in cinema. Cinema will essentially become, in my view, more experiential rather than, just, you kind of decide to go for a cinema thing. So the big movies, the Marvel movies and everything will continue to be watched in cinemas, simply because they'll turn it more and more into an experience. That's where technologies like VR, etc., already being experimented with, and that will become even more experiential over the last. And it's already been it's already was moving towards an experiential sort of form for the last many years. Little changes like the Dolby sound was essentially to increase the experiential part of it, or 3D, or chairs moving, the experiential part of it. There are movie halls where if it rains, there's a little bit of a little bit of water on your head. So I think cinema will become more and more experiential, whereas independent cinema will largely go on more and more into the OTT platforms like Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, etc. And they'll probably have a better home as well, because when they get limited releases, in some cases, they're competing against these large, big budget movies, which are with its graphics and its experiences. So I do think that OTT and Netflix and the Amazons and the Disneys become the home of independent television, whereas cinema becomes the home of large experiential cinema, basically movies.
Okay, so to round off, and we come a full circle to journalism, and your heritage personally is journalism, though you have moved on to bigger things since then. But and many in our audience are students, and many of them might be considering media or journalism as career options. So, having said all of this, and that journalists have had to move up from just reporting that an accident happened here and a protest happened there, to views and to the story behind the story, and so on. Um, so and that needs to have a view, or to write an op-ed, or to comment on why is this farmer protest happening. They are no longer reporting that there are 10,000 people on the border of Delhi. That everyone knows instantly on various social media. They are having to explain why is it happening, what are the intricacies of agriculture policy and these three laws, and what are the pros and cons and all of that. That needs experience. That needs a journalist to have lived through a few such cycles. So what does a new journalist do? Is there a career path still for fresh, new, young people to get into journalism if they don't, if there's no stories to tell, if there's no reporting to do? Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think, I I do believe that there's if you like journalism and that's you're curious by nature, it's an incredible field to be in. And I think, all the challenges notwithstanding, there's also opportunities. It's just growing in different ways. And younger people who get in, you adapt to it. When I was starting my career, we were going through a big TV boom in India, and I joined, TV 18 after CNN. And I remember that the excitement of that small newsroom. But the thing is, it was still a very small company, and it just exploded. And that was a big technological shift that led to that boom. And I think everyone will experience that. Any journalist coming out of journalism school will experience that in different ways. So it'll be, digital, and, for some it'll be social media, for some it'll be, sort of create the creator, sort of model for some. But I think there'll always be a space for good journalism, and good, sort of. And by the way, when we say journalism, I think everyone ends up thinking of covering politics in Delhi, or covering business news in Mumbai. There is an entire universe out there that will never be covered any other way other than someone reporting. I spent a lot of time on my, good part of my career, doing conflict journalism. It cannot be replaced by a computer. It cannot be replaced by anyone. There'll always be someone being on the scene and actually telling it as is. And I think, and because of that, I don't think journalism is going to die, because you always need people to document. And of course, you need to know more. I'm a big believer in going through journalism school, because it kind of puts the basics into you, and then apprenticing, because that's what I did, because that taught me a lot of things. It taught you don't know everything, and I think if with a little bit of humility, and sort of that you don't know everything, even if you think you do, I think it's a great field to be in.
So in the very old days, much older than your days, I'm talking about my days, when I was starting up, there were these things called cub reporters, or they were frivolously called cub reporters, who were like these fresh reporters who were told to go to the police station and collect crime reports, or
Yeah,
go to
I did that.
the traffic department and collect accident reports. Is that
Yeah.
is gone now? We don't need those kind of.
Not really. I think, it has so much value even now. Those have taken different kind of forms. People just tweet it out immediately, etc. So it's kind of changed a little bit in its form. But essentially, I don't think that has changed so dramatically, because you still, what is commoditized news? Someone is covering it still. Someone is actually finding that out even now. This is not a computer generating something. This is someone putting it out there, right? So that someone who's putting it out there is ideally a journalist. Today you see, citizen journalism, and all sorts of other things which you can always question. But really, a journalist's job of actually collecting, going and doing that hard work of actually finding this out, going to a police station, which I spent a lot of time in my earliest part of my career, interning. When I was, interned at Indian Express once, we spent a lot of time in a cop station trying to find little reports and trying to find a story. And a lot of the time you never found anything. Sometimes you did. And I don't think that's changed. You still have to dig those out. And I think it's become more opaque. So you have to dig a little further. So I just don't think journalism has changed that much. I think I do think the ethos of journalism, the guidelines and the rules of it, have not changed. I think it's just the dissemination of it, and the way it's presented and produced is different. I think the ethics and the guidelines are pretty much the same. And I think will remain the same.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. That's an optimistic note to end the conversation and bring in the audience into it. So the way we do Q&A, Parry, is some people might want to come on camera and ask their questions in person. Sure. On video, and some we might read their questions from the chat box. So Bijal will get us started and bring some questions in. And while we are doing that, Parry, if you want to scroll through and any questions that tickles your fancy, feel free to pick those up afterwards. Sure. But we'll start with Bijal.
Sure. Please. No problem.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Parry, for that very interesting and engaging conversation. I think I'll first start with a question which is by Vaidehi Somaya. Vaidehi says that social media has aided access to news and people for everyone. This should be in an ideal situation that it should make media houses and journalists more diligent, aware, and responsible for what they present to the world. But in many cases, we are witnessing something different, something opposite, which is depressing. How do you see this might change the future? And I'm just adding my bit here that, I mean, can this really be controlled or what can be done about it?
So I think this is where organizations are so important. Organizations usually have rules that you make. That's why you have editors, and that's why you have a hierarchy of people who take, who actually essentially are laying the ground rules of how journalists should behave, should report things, whether there is, what the fact that the report they sent is factually correct, etc. So I think a lot of that rests in an organization if you are in an organization. So the challenge is that you may not be in an organization. You may be an independent journalist, writing on one of the platforms, and that's it. That part is very difficult to do anything about. And what we call fake news or disinformation is essentially coming from that universe of people who can put anything out there, right? By the way, everyone blames social media for disinformation, but social media is also great for information as well. I mean, if there's something happening in another part of the world where a journalist is not there, I wish when I was covering, days when I used to cover conflict, I wish there were these sources, because in those days you had to just get there. There's no other way. But I think today you can, someone can just take a video and send it to you, or send it out there, and then all you have to do is verify. So there are two sides to it, but there's also an incredible amount of disinformation out there. I mean, if you're a journalist and you kind of are sowing disinformation, I think, and you work for an organization, the organization is responsible for it, and the organization has to put rules around it. Most people don't, but without those rules, journalism is not journalism; it's something else.
Absolutely. I think it's a very, very responsible position to be at, considering the way we are. Yeah. I mean, information is open and available, and the possibility to disseminate what we feel or think is so much easier now than when it was before. So I would say, as much as the
and also I do believe that.
Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. I also do believe that organizations are great for journalism because there are so many layers. Anyone who's, I remember sending things back from the field. What I see, I see with a little bit of bias, and I'm sort of influenced by the environment I'm in. Whereas someone who's looking at it objectively, a new pair of eyes, is looking at it and asking difficult questions of us, and that's where organizations become more, that's where media houses become more responsible. I think that's where responsibility comes.
Yeah, absolutely. One of our participants, Asha Ethan, would also like to ask a question, but Asha would like to sort of ask a question by on her own. So Asha, would you like to raise your question there? We will just unmute you.
Yes, sir. I think you've hi. I think you've slightly. I think you've answered it partly, but just to clarify further, just before I ask the question, I wanted to know, I'm a big admirer of this courageous journalism, but still, do you think that it's sort of callous to say that there's no such thing as objectivity between in both views and the news? There's only like a difference in the degree of bias that they have. So I was reading this guy called Malcolm Muggeridge, who was this very colorful journalist and then became huge critic of media. So what he's saying is that the faking possibilities, especially in the cutting room, are well nigh illimitable, and people now clamoring for the televising of Parliament should realize this and the great power it will put in the hands of whoever edits the footage. So, I mean, and if that's the case, nobody can at the end of the day be completely biased. Do we correct to say that the smallest degree of objectivity is, in these sourcing agencies like Reuters or AFP?
Yeah, I think 100% objectivity is, I think it's important, it is impossible to achieve. And also, to be honest, it's I don't even know. It's such a fine line. So if you say, for instance, if a reporter sees someone being killed, can that reporter and that person's the murderer's trial is on trial? Can that person 100% be objectively and say that, yeah, I'm just going to take his, I'm going to take a view of his and a view of that? But there is a right and wrong in that, right? There is this man or this person was killing someone. It happens in these war situations where when you're covering conflicts, someone is on the wrong, or someone is, has done something that obviously deserves to be put in a certain way. So in those kind of cases, your opinion comes in. It's in some cases not even an opinion. It is essentially what it is. So it's impossible to go through complete objectivity, and I don't think anyone strives for 100% objectivity. So one of the rules of journalism, and this is why Reuters or Bloomberg, CNN, New York Times, all of them, all subscribe to the 3 source rule. And when you have 3 sources from different backgrounds and different ways, in sort of different parts of the story, this is your way to actually keep it as objective as possible. Is it 100% objective? Unlikely, because even those people will have their views and all sorts of things. But at least it gets it close. But degree of bias is a nice way of putting it. But as long as the degree of bias is somewhere closer to the center than it is towards two sides of the spectrum, I think you've done what you can.
Sure, thanks.
Because without that, I think without that, if journalists you mentioned who criticize the media, but if media did not exist, none of that exists. So you have to always think about with or without media. If that ecosystem did not exist, that media, sort of journalism did not exist, what would we be? What information would we be getting? Do we want raw information? That's a hard question to answer. I don't know whether everyone can process pure raw information.
Thanks.
Thank you, Parry. I think that was quite academic, but a very honest answer. That to what level of closeness can we get in terms of at the center, in terms of the bias? Ultimately, opinions do matter, and the way they are projected, that matters as well, apart from the facts. There's a question from Amol, our colleague Amol Agarwal. Media is seen as the 4th pillar of democracy. Media should be in the center, but of late it is under serious pressure from both people and polity. This is making media move right or left. How can media organizations sustain this pressure? So
I always believe that media is run by ideology. It's not. After being in this field for so long, there are some ideological positions that media take. Fox or Republic and all sorts of things. But a lot of media's tilts are based on, and certainly in India, are based on economics. Who controls? So, for instance, small example: whoever controls the government budgets, which is a substantial amount of money, controls the media. It's, by the way, that's for years. That's run for years. So that's an example. And I think then, of course, there's and that comes from a serious pressure on the bottom line and on the business model and everything else that come with it. So I think the right and left ideological is a slightly more, it's slightly in an equal sort of on an equal plane. I think you'll find that right and left is less important if it's all equal. As in there are 2 parties and right and left, and neither of them are in power. I think that gap sort of narrows a little bit more than you would think, because someone is in power, they hold the reins of power and hold the budgets and hold pretty much everything that a media company sort of relies on. they look, it looks as if it's tilted more towards them or ideologically than otherwise. So there is a lot of economics that most people don't realize that plays a huge role in all of this. I think much more than people end up thinking, and that's unfortunate because that should not. And this is what I was saying, that responsible government or responsible governments all over the world should essentially not try to kill the media or control the media, and actually try and be able to foster an environment. Look, I think a lot of countries do it well. In the UK, there's Ofcom it's an independent regulator which makes sure that TV journalism does not go the Fox way there. And there are regulators there are these fully independent, non-political regulators that essentially have enough power to actually to manage them. And I think that is the only way to go. The more control governments have over everything, it's much harder I think corporate control is one thing, but government control is a completely bigger beast.
Absolutely. Amol, I hope that was an answer to your question. And we also have our colleague Himani Bakshi. She would like to ask a question. So Himani, sure. Would you like to come?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Bijal. I'm unable to switch on the video, so I'll just ask. No thanks, Parry. It was a great session. Of late, particularly in last 1 year during the COVID, I have come across a lot of news in the regional channel, in the vernacular language. Mm-hmm. And it's like mushrooming industry, every nook and corner you see news channels, offices. Before that, I was actually of the opinion that government should not interfere and there should be freedom of speech. Let these journalists, write and speak. But I think so far we were talking about Bloomberg and CNN. But my question is about the quality of the news in these regional channels. And at times it's incorrect, it's pathetic. I have closely watched them when, for example, they invite you for budget sessions and that the journalist sitting there has not done a homework at all. The content is an issue. And my worry is that mass of the people in our country rely on these channels, or this is the biggest source of information for people in the small towns who can't read English, who can't even read good vernacular language newspapers, but they rely mostly on these news channels. And there are heroes that have emerged. So we have local Arnav Goswami also. So my worry is that, how do you really balance this? I mean, if there's no regulation on them, there is no check on the quality or the technical aspects. I mean, so it's getting chaotic, in fact. So that's my worry.
So that's a really good question because there is a regulation. It's just not regulated the way it should be regulated. Regulation is based on by the way, the barrier of entry into news has come down dramatically. The barrier of entry for TV news came down years ago. So anyone who had some influence with the government could get a TV license. Political parties, got TV licenses. There are a lot of and the ones that the governments don't like, they keep out. So this kind of sort of I say part regulation because it is regulated, over-regulated, in the sense that they are gatekeepers. Governments become gatekeepers, allowing in people who kind of it's based not on quality or anything else. It's based on ideological or in some cases a position that a TV the owner of a TV network has, rather than based on quality. So I think this comes from a really no one held accountable for quality or anything that's put out there, unless they are from a a group of people that you don't, that the government, from an opposition group or anything, or anyone else. But that's, again, like I said, I think that's been going on for years. That's not new, and that has actually spoiled local journalism it has spoiled sort of regional journalism quite a lot, and depends on where you are. I'm from Kerala, and in Kerala, the regional journalism is doing really well. I mean, it's one of those places where almost everyone watches Malayalam news channels. So it depends on where you are, but it definitely does. It is a real problem, and there is no one body which actually pulls people up for quality, for sure. In fact, there is just zero. I mean, we have a ministry. We don't have a body outside of press council, etc., which actually is not that effective in controlling these things. But we don't have any other body which actually does put onus on quality, and that's a challenge. And that's unfortunately, there's nothing you can do unless there's an actual serious attempt to try and improve the quality from everyone, including the government. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, Bijal.
Thank you, Himani. We also have Aryan with us, who would like to raise his question on the mic. So Aryan, would you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, please?
Yes, sir. As you mentioned earlier that the current economical parity of the print media is going down, and vis-a-vis the print media, the houses which run print media, they also upload the content online, and for which they don't charge. In taking this under the consideration, and even taking the consideration that the major income from the media houses are from advertising. So how can a young entrepreneur like us look forward in the business of media, where the only option of earning an income is through advertising?
Yeah, I don't think advertising is the only way to get revenue. In fact, I actually think that advertising is, in my view, right now, the advertising is probably one of the more difficult ways to get revenue, because most of advertising is kind of not even going to media houses, large media houses, it's going to the Facebooks and the Googles. They're kind of almost sweeping up a lot of the advertising. And now there are so many platforms, so it's not, competing with platforms for advertising is really tough. It's really, I mean, I'm a believer that it's subscription is a way forward, is one of the way forwards, because that is, it's a direct engagement with a subscriber. You're kind of catering to the audience, you directly, rather than through different means, and then you're under no pressure from an external party. And of course, there's one big question is will if you have 50,000 subscribers, they all get together, bandy together, and say, this is what we want you to cover. That's never happened before. That could happen tomorrow. But that's a threat. But we look at the threat when it comes there. But that, I think, is the way forward. And frankly, everyone is now going that way as well. So I know internationally, almost everyone has gone the subscription route. In India, they've already started. Business Standard, Bloomberg Quint, which I was deeply associated with. They were very early entrants. I know Times of India's Economic Times has started it. I think that will change somewhat the relationship between the media company and the consumer in a lot of ways. And I think so. I don't think advertising should always be an additive, in my personal view. It's a great additive. If you get advertising as well, it's great. But it's difficult to kind of sustain yourself on advertising alone on the digital part of the thing. I mean, it's there are various factors. It's not just the fact that advertising is going to Facebooks, etc. It's also because if you're small organizations, you don't have pricing power, so they can really thump you down on pricing and everything else. So it's the economics of it is fairly complicated.
Aryan, I hope that adds some more light to what you had asked in the question. But indeed, I think I do agree that there are several factors which play a role, and it's not just advertising alone. It is also as much got to do with what kind of content we have. It's also got to do with so many other factors. I'll just quickly slip in my question, Parry, because it's somewhere directly indirectly to what Aryan had asked and a couple of other questions as well. So we typically say, that the 80-20 rule in so many different elements, but here when it comes to, content online, not just journalism, etc., but content online, they say that the 20-80, rule. So 20 is your content and the way you write it, the way you create it, and 80% or so is how you promote it. That it gets noticed.
Yeah.
What is your view on that?
I would always flip the other way around, and maybe it's because I'm a journalist and I ran it, and ran a media company. I don't think unless there is a big premium on quality today, because there's just so many news sources are out there that essentially if you don't, you need to be unique and have that sort of quality, the highest quality that you can get to be able to actually get the audience. Because no matter how, if your quality is weak and your content is weak, no matter how well you distribute it, it might get a spurt, a momentary spurt, but eventually it'll go back to what it is because people won't come back to it. So I would always flip it to 80-20. I think 20 is everything else. 80 is really focus on the quality of it, and then you focus on the business. Business comes secondary because it's actually, it's the quality that matters. And I'm a journalist who also ran the business, and I always find fascinating when journalists become entrepreneurs, because I actually wish more journalists become entrepreneurs, because I do think that they know the content better than anyone else sitting on the business side, because they are just dealing with this every day and being able to actually craft it the way someone consumes it and then be able to sell it. So I think, I think 80-20 is mine. It would be my rule. I think everyone will vary a little bit, but most journalists, I think, will stick to the 80-20 rule.
I'm so glad you said that. I wanted that to come from you for all our student body to hear as well. That ultimately it's the quality which matters, no matter how much of everything else ancillary that you do around it. If you want your content to sustain, if you want your content to genuinely get noticed, it has to be the quality and the persistency with which you work on that quality all the time. So we also have our colleague Sudhir. So Sudhir, I invite you to please raise your question. I think we have a couple of questions mentioned there in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at the time, I'll go with the second question. Thank you, Parry. It is wonderful to hear this conversation. I also work with Times of India to increase their readership in Gujarat. And though they are on the top, but still regional news is affecting them so much. But I had a bit of different question. I see that people talk about this data poverty, and they say that there are certain countries in global south or otherwise where news media do not want to get into this, and they don't want to report their issues, because it is obvious there are a lot of news media which only wants to get into a certain kind of news, or the news which is sellable, which is familiar. At the same time, even in a country like India, there are certain populations where data poverty exists. I mean, no news media goes there and report their issues. I know it is a political pressure and there are a lot of other things. It is not a sellable news. Nobody wants them to do that kind of charity. But still, I want to know from you as an insider, how do media houses look these kinds of issues? Like if something is not getting reported from a poor country or from a vulnerable population, how do they approach this? How do they see this entire news formation of this country?
It's a really good question. I think, when a media organization thinks, and certainly in a global media organization, when you are spread thin, so you can't have, bureaus in every country in the world. So you kind of give some sort of primacy to a story that is more than just a local story, right? That's the first rule in, when you're making a sort of decision on deployments, or in deploying journalists, etc. That's the first rule. And I think then the second thing is if it's actually if it's a big story in that country and it's it's highly interesting, it has something that actually has some sort of there's a genocide. I mean, genocide in one of the African countries which was in the 20 years ago, it was quite quite rampant. Then you would do it not you would do it for the world, because that is an important story that has to come out to the world. I don't think it's that dissimilar when you look at it in a domestic market. When you first take a decision, it all depends on whether that story is important. So I'll give you a small example, which bus toppling over and 30 people dying. You always hear of it, and you always see these small snippets on it. It's 30 people dying. I always wonder, when 30 people is dying, isn't that a story, right? And this was before I actually went into a newsroom. I used to always think that's an important story to cover, and I still do, actually. But when you come into a newsroom, there is just so much happening that you have to make a choice. And with the amount of resources you have, you end up making a choice on what you will cover and what you can't. It's not, in many cases, it's not omission. It is just fact that you cannot get everywhere. That said, there are plenty of important things that people don't cover at all. Rural India is very poorly covered. I think there are amazing organizations now that are covering it. The Parry network, is a good example. There's India Spend, which is doing a lot of data digging. There are sort of Gaon Connection. I mean, there's just a lot of these small media organizations which have really gone deep and trying to cover them. But it is very poorly covered. It still today is. I mean, we are essentially, all media companies are between Delhi, Bombay, the metros, basically. Delhi, Bombay is almost 60-70%, and then the rest of the cities kind of combined will be a few. But beyond the tier 1, if you go down, it actually gets pretty thin. But unless it's politics, there's a big, West Bengal politics, it'll be all over, all over. And now politics it's almost gamified. We have politics is no more coverage. It's actually a game. So we kind of almost all of us are kind of watching it every day as if it's there's some reality show going on. So I think that's how it is. I don't think I don't think there's been a change in the last 20 years in how news organizations have covered the rest of India or issues. I think it's just that most of the cases just not front of mind.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, you have to make a choice, a kind of decision, what to show, what not to show. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
And look, we have gone through these. We have also gone through a phase where people were covering a child falling into a well. So I'm trying to be generic in this case, where all channels go and sort of cover that. With that aside, the sensationalism aside, as a pure news story, there are choices you have to make every day in a newsroom, and that's a choice that a news leader always has to make every day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Proximity. I think proximity is the big factor.
Parry, I know that we have already exceeded the time that we had taken from you. So can we take another 2 or 3 minutes from you? Or do
of course, yeah, please. Yeah. No. I'm no.
So I think we might close on this. There's been questions about it most lately from Dhruv Majumdar and others on free speech on social media. Just to expand on that question with my own conundrum on that is what we keep saying that social media owners keep saying that they are just a platform, that they don't curate news, they are just a platform, it's a user generated news. Don't blame me on what goes on my platform, I'm just a neutral platform. And then on the other hand, and so that's like very free speech. Anyone says anything on Facebook, Twitter is fair game because Mark Zuckerberg will turn around and say, not my fault. I am just a platform. But then they swing on the other extreme and throw Donald Trump out of their platform because he was violating their terms of agreement. So are we as a society, just picking that Donald Trump example, but Twitter has been suspending accounts in India also for very frivolous reasons. Salil Tripathi is a case in point. And
I know,
eminent academics and authors' accounts have been. So is it just a platform or is it a police? And are we fine in delegating the policeman role to private enterprises like Twitter and Facebook, isn't it the government's job to decide whether Donald Trump or Salil Tripathi or whoever is violating free speech or is doing something not legal? Or is it Twitter's and Facebook's job? So this, we keep kind of um, uh, swinging between these two extremes of the pendulum. We are just a platform. You say what you want, not my fault. No, we are the policemen. So where are we, and where will we settle on that?
So I think it's a really thin line. For one, let me take the case of the social media companies. Their challenge is, it's again, like I said, I think it's damned if they do, damned if they don't, right? When I mean, a case of India, for instance, where they were asked to remove some sort of accounts, and which they did, and then they put it back. So when they took it out, there's one side said that's unfair. The other side, said it's fair, and when the other way around, when they actually put it back, it inverse. Now the challenge is, I don't think everyone's going to be ever happy, right? The problem with social media is that it is, by its nature, user generated. It's all entirely user generated. So when Mark Zuckerberg says that it's not my problem, it's someone else putting that content, he's essentially saying, I'm giving you the platform, and it's user generated content that is going onto the platform. That's his defense. That said, I think between it's a tough choice, at least for me personally, to make a decision on whether I like these corporates to make that decision for me or the government, because I can give both of them. I can give fair amount of examples where they've both twisted and used it to their advantage. In the case of corporates, they're doing it for profit. They're doing it for profit. They want the audience, they want the interaction, they want the engagement, right? For governments, if it's fully government regulated, the challenge is that someone in power can essentially use everything they want to be able to actually regulate the message going out there, and ensure that what the messages they don't like, they won't allow it. And that's the challenge. So I don't think there is, unfortunately, it's somewhere in the middle. Again, I believe there has to be an independent body that actually puts rules around these. And this is, by the way, for social media, it's rules globally. It should not be it should be a global consistent rule, rather than, let's throw Trump out in the US, but let's keep everyone who's spewing hate in India, because that doesn't matter to us. That's too far for us. So that's the challenge, So you need one consistent rule and one body that actually does, an independent body that actually puts these rules around it. And I'll be honest, I think the social media companies they're so tired of this that they'll be up for it. They'll be up for it. I don't think, they hate the word regulation, but if you couch it in some other language, I'm sure they'll be fine with it. Because it is becoming more and more toxic, and it is becoming difficult for them to control. They are in front of the Senate almost every second day, trying to justify their existence. And I'm sure if there are rules around this and algorithms, and they will create algorithms around those rules, I think they will be consistent all over the world. I think everyone wins.
Great. Okay. Thank you. From my side, that was it. One personal benefit of this conversation for me was an hour and a half ago, I was looking at doomsday scenarios, and I had kind of total pessimism about the future of media and journalism. You have kind of brought me a bit towards optimism, if not completely glass half full. I'm not glass half empty now. I'm kind of in the middle. So thank you so much. So I'll now hand you back. We've taken more time than we had asked you for. So I'll hand you back to Bijal to see if there's any last question, and then close.
Thank you, Ravi. From doomsday to good news, I think I want to sort of bring this very interesting conversation to a close with one last question about good news journalism. Parry, is there anything called as good news journalism, or is it ever discussed in your industry, in your circle on coffee tables? And do you think if it ever...
a lot of people have tried putting shows that essentially shows only good news.
Yeah.
And or websites which essentially, in fact, I think there was even a media company called Good News. But I think it's news is just news, right? It's, if something's not going right, if society is not going the right way, and that is what it is, and that's what it's going to reflect. I think there is no good news or bad news. It's just news, in my view. I don't think, by the way, the other thing is it's slightly subjective. What is good news for you? Someone lost an election, maybe good news for you, maybe bad news for someone else. So that's the problem, So I just don't think there is an all-pervasive good news in the world. Someone is always a loser, and someone is always unhappy about the outcome of that news. Let me put it that way.
Wow, that's a very, very interesting answer, Parry. Again, two sides of a coin. The way you said it, that what may be good news for somebody may not be, good news for somebody else. But that again leaves me, at least I would like to end it with a happy note that at least everything is a good news for somebody somewhere. So
exactly,
the world is a better place at some point, sometime. Yeah. Thank you so much, Parry, for that really wonderful interaction. And thank you, Ravi, for
moving
forward so beautifully. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.